In 1697, all of Europe held its breath. One of the largest armies, the Ottoman Empire, had march music in decades. Tens of thousands of soldiers, cannons, cavalry, banners, and the Sultan himself. Music was moving north like a flood one believed could be stopped. If they broke through the frontier, the map of Europe would change. If they weren't stopped, the world we know today might look very different. Music, and then on. A quiet river bank almost no European had ever heard of. Two armies collided. One was music halfway across the river, packed onto a long wooden bridge. The other arrived behind them faster than anyone thought music possible. Cannons roared. The ground shook. The bridge split. Music under the weight. Men, horses, and wagons plunged into the rushing Tisa, the Ottoman camp. Music erupted in panic. Orders lost in the chaos. Screams drowned by the river. What happened at Zenta didn't just end a campaign. It ended an era and altered the fate of an entire continent. In the late 1600s, Europe was exhausted. For more than a decade, the Great Turkish War had dragged across the heart of the continent, pulling cities, farms, kingdoms, and entire regions into a conflict with no clear end. People still remember the terror of 1683, when the Ottoman Empire reached the walls of Vienna. Even years later, families spoke about that moment as if it had happened yesterday. Fear like that stays in the blood. Now, in 1697, word began to spread again. Quiet at first, then louder, and soon no one could ignore what the messengers were saying. The Ottoman Empire was gathering a massive army, larger, louder, and more determined than anything Europe had seen. Since the failed siege music of Vienna, Sultan Mustafa II wanted more than a routine campaign. He wanted a victory so overwhelming that Europe would remember it for generations. He wanted to erase every humiliation, rebuild every ounce of lost prestige, and prove that the empire was still a force capable of reshaping borders. So he called his soldiers from every corner of the empire. Janissaries marched in, long perfect lines, their white turbans, catching the sun. Cede cavalry rode beside them, their armor polished like mirrors. Anatolian riders, Balkan infantry, Crimean Tatar horsemen, cannon, crews, engineers, blacksmiths, cooks, servants, wagon drivers, and musicians poured into the roads until the army became a moving city that stretched for miles. Massive siege guns were pulled by teams of oxen. Wagon trains carried powder, tents, spare weapons, tools, and the Sultan's own treasure. Green, red, and gold banners snapped in the wind, marking the advance of an empire that still believed in its destiny. Villagers said the ground shook long after the soldiers passed. Witnesses described the column as a river of metal, dust, leather, and sound. An entire world on the march. Europe heard the news and fear returned immediately. Couriers raced through Vienna and across Habsburg lands. Reports came in from Serbia, Hungary, and the Danube frontier. Ottoman engineers were building supply depots. Tatar scouts were riding deep into the plains. And the most alarming detail of all, the Sultan himself was leading the campaign. This was not a border raid. This was not a clears throat seasonal push. This was an empire moving with purpose. Across Central Europe, bells rang. Fortresses stocked grain and gunpowder. Local nobles sent urgent messages to Vienna. Families had food, gathered children, and prepared for worst. Some escaped north before the roads clogged with armies. In the middle of this rising panic stood a commander who had spent most of his life being underestimated. Prince Eugene of Savoy. He wasn't loud. He wasn't imposing, but he was sharp. sharper than most gave him credit for. And he understood something that many in the imperial court refused to see. The Habsburg position was fragile. Their forces were tired. Their treasury was thin. And if the Ottomans broke through Hungary again, Europe could face another disaster like 1683 is critical. When Eugene received word of the Ottoman march, he felt the weight of the moment. Immediately, if the Sultan's army moved fast, Hungary could fall again. If he hesitated, Vienna might be threatened again. And if he waited for orders, it could already be too late. So he made a choice. He gathered every soldier he could, German infantry, Austrian cavalry, Hungarian units, Serbian militia, anyone willing to fight. His army was smaller, poorer, and far less supplied than the Ottoman force, but it could move fast, and speed, he knew, was the one advantage the empire could not match. Eugene decided he would shadow the Ottoman army, follow their movements closely, and search for the one moment when their vast size would turn into a weakness. Every great campaign had a point where even the strongest army became vulnerable. He didn't know yet where that moment would appear. He didn't know yet when the Ottomans would slip. But the roads both armies marched, the scouting paths they followed, the river crossings they approached, all of it was already leading them toward a place almost no one in Europe had heard of. A small town beside a slow, muddy river, a place called Zenta. As the summer of 1697 unfolded, the Ottoman army moved north like a living tide. Villages watched from their doorways as endless lines of soldiers passed, armored cavalry, janissaries with their tall white headgear, wagon teams, cannons, herds of animals, and caravans, carrying enough supplies to feed a small nation. Wherever the column went, dust filled the air and the road shook under the sheer weight of it. To the soldiers inside this massive machine, it felt as if the empire itself was marching. Music beside them, the banners, the music, the drums echoing across hills and riverbanks. It all reinforced the same belief. They were part of something immense, unstoppable, and destined to reclaim what had been lost. But behind all the spectacle, a harsher truth traveled with them. The Ottoman army was huge music, but it was slow. Its wagons stretched for miles. Its supply lines reached deep into territories already strained by years of war. Orders took too long to travel, and many officers worried more about pleasing the palace than winning battles. Still, the momentum carried them forward. On the other side of the continent, Europe watched the advance. Like a looming music storm, reports flooded into Vienna. Ottoman scouts in the forest music near the Tisa, supply caravans snaking through Serbia, bridge building crews preparing, crossings over the Danube. Each detail added weight to the realization that the Sultan wasn't simply testing music, the borders. He was trying to reshape them. Meetings at the imperial court became tense, filled with raised voices and nervous debates. Some advisors insisted on a defensive stance, arguing that the Habsburg armies were too tired and too spread out music to risk a major confrontation. Others argued that retreat would only invite disaster, the same kind of disaster Vienna had nearly faced in music 1683. Every hour brought new rumors, new fears, and new pressure. Amid all of this stood Prince Eugene of Savoy, studying maps that looked more like bruises and borders, territories scarred by years of raids, burned villages, lost fortresses, and shifting loyalties. Hungary was not a clean war zone. Music, it was a patchwork of abandoned fields, refugee pathways, and towns, divided between Ottoman supporters, Habsburg loyalists, and those who simply wanted the fighting to end. Eugene's army was smaller, but it was not weak. Music. He commanded veteran German and Austrian infantry who had fought the Ottomans before. He had Hungarian units who knew every bend in the rivers and every ridge that offered a good ambush point. He had Serbian militia capable of slipping through forests unnoticed. Music. His cavalry was experienced, lean, and fast, and his best weapon of all, scouts who understood the land better than any map could show. Everyday information poured in. Small groups of Serbian riders shadowed the edges of the Ottoman march, slipping through marshes and wooded music hills, sending back reports about troop numbers, marching, speed, wagon music movements, and the faint trails left by Tatar scouts. Bit by bit, Eugene pieced together a music picture the imperial court couldn't see. The Ottoman army was heading toward the Tisa River. Music, and when an army that large approached a river crossing, it always created the same moment. A moment where thousands music of men, animals, guns, and supplies would be stuck between two banks. Music, exposed and unable to fight at full strength. Eugene understood instantly. Music, what that meant. If he could reach the Tisa at the right time, he could end the entire campaign in music, one decisive strike. Not through a siege, not through a drawn-out battle, but in a single moment where the empire's weight became its music own weakness. Still, it was a gamble, a dangerous one. His army had to move faster than music seemed possible. They had to take rough roads, cross rivers at awkward music points, and march without the rest they needed. If they pushed too hard, the men could collapse. If they pushed too slowly, they would arrive too late and face a fully formed Ottoman army on the far bank. Worse, Vienna expected him to be cautious. Couriers rode back and forth with commands urging him not to take unnecessary risks, not to gamble the empire's remaining strength on one throw of the dice. But Eugene had seen enough wars to know that hesitation could be fatal. He trusted his instincts. He trusted the intelligence coming from the Serbian scouts. And he trusted the one rule that had never failed him. The bigger the enemy force, the more fragile it becomes during a river crossing. So he pushed forward. Day after day, the Habsburg army moved in a fast, narrow formation, cutting across hills, marshes, and broken roads to shadow the Ottoman march without being seen. Eugene kept his movements quiet. No long fires. At night, no loud camp signals. No unnecessary noise. He wanted to remain a shadow, a threat. The Ottomans did not yet realize was following them. But for all his planning, Eugene did not know exactly where the moment would come. Not yet. He only knew that every mile they marched, every stream they crossed, every hour they gained or lost was bringing two armies closer to the same point on the map. Music, a point where their fates would collide, a point neither side could avoid. The muddy, slow-moving waters of the Tisa River were waiting, and the town of Zenta stood just beyond the bend, unaware that history was already marching straight, music toward it. By early September, the Ottoman army reached the wide, muddy stretch of the Tisa River near the small town of Zenta. To the soldiers who marched for weeks, the river looked calm, slow, and harmless. But for an army this large, a river was never harmless. It was a barrier that forced everything, men, horses, cannons, wagons to compress into narrow lines and wait their turn. Still, the Ottomans believed they were safe. Their scouts reported no major enemy forces nearby. Their officers expected at least several quiet days to build a proper crossing, and with the Sultan himself overseeing the march. No one. Imagine a disaster waiting beyond the horizon. Engineers moved forward first, hammering planks and stabilizing the long wooden bridge that stretched across the brown water. The crossing began. Slowly, wagons creaked onto the bridge. Horses kicked nervously at the boards. Cannons rolled forward one by one, each movement groaning through iron rims and wooden wheels. The vanguard reached the far bank and started forming a camp. Fires were lit. Tents rose. The atmosphere felt almost routine, but beneath the surface, danger was already taking shape. The army was stretched across miles of open ground. Half was on the near bank, half was beginning to gather on the far side, and a thick, bottleneck crowd waited at the center. If someone struck now, the Ottomans would be split in two. No one at the crossing believed such a strike was possible. No one imagined Prince Eugene's army was already racing toward them. Far away, Eugene's scouts had completed the final piece of the puzzle. They rode through mud, marshland, and forest to bring him the news. The Ottoman army was at the river, crossing, exposed and unaware. Eugene didn't hesitate. He gave the order to march. With everything they had left, his soldiers, already tired, pulled tighter on their belts and pushed forward. They didn't complain. They understood the tone of his command. This was not another day of following the enemy's trail. This was movement with purpose on. A fast, silent, and dangerous. Serbian militia guided them along narrow, hidden paths. They avoided villages, avoided smoke, avoided any sign that could alert the Sultan's scouts. They arrived at hilltops overlooking the plains and saw dust rising in the distance. The Ottoman column, exactly where the scouts said it would be. Every mile mattered now. Every minute mattered. The Habsburg army moved like a shadow, curving behind the Ottoman position Eugene wanted to strike from. The rear where the camp, the bridge, and the greatest confusion would be. He kept his men close and tight, marching in a formation built for speed. No music, no banners raised, only the sound of boots and hooves pounding the earth. Then in the middle of this tense advance, a courier arrived from Vienna. The emperor's orders were clear. Be cautious. Avoid unnecessary risks. Do not gamble the army. Eugene read the message once, and then he put away. He wasn't being reckless. He was being realistic. If he obeyed, the Ottomans would finish crossing the river, regroup, and strike back with overwhelming force. If he waited even one more night, the chance would be gone. This moment, right now, was the only moment where the empire's size worked against it. So he pushed harder. By late afternoon, the Habsburg army could hear distant shouting from the riverbank. They could smell the smoke of campfires, the glow of the late sun reflecting off Ottoman armor. But the Ottomans still didn't see them. The river, the bridge, and the chaos of the crossing blocked their view. What Eugene saw when he reached the final ridge made a decision for him. There, stretched out along the bank, was everything he had been waiting for. Thousands of Ottoman troops crowded together, carts and cannons jammed in narrow paths, the bridge groaning under the weight of men and animals, officers shouting to keep order, the Sultan himself watching from the far bank, seeing only the movement directly in front of him, not the threat forming behind. The Ottomans believed they were safe. They believed they had time. They believed no enemy could reach them this quickly. And then as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, imperial banners rose over the ridge. At first, a few Ottoman soldiers turned, confused by shapes in the distance. Then more turned. Then the shouting changed. Across the riverbank, a silence spread. The kind of silence that comes not from calm, but from shock. When the impossible suddenly becomes real. Prince Eugene's entire army was standing behind them, fully formed, perfectly arranged, and ready to strike. The Ottomans had walked into a trap they never saw coming. The river was at their back. The bridge was overloaded. The enemy was at their rear, and the sky was beginning to darken. Everything was about to collapse. The moment Prince Eugene gave the order, the quiet ridge behind Zenta erupted into motion. Imperial infantry moved, first forming long, tight lines that advanced with steady determination. Cavalry swept to the flanks, lowering their lances as the last light of the day glinted off helmets and steel. Artillery crews unhitched their guns, with practice speed planting wheels, deep into the soil and turning the barrels toward the densest clusters of the Ottoman camp across the riverbank. The Ottomans had only seconds to understand what was happening. There was no time for preparation, no time to form proper ranks. Officers shouted conflicting commands. Soldiers ran toward weapons piled near the tents. Drummers tried to beat assembly signals, but their calls were drowned out by the chaos rising around them. The first cannon blast from the imperial line tore through the confusion. It struck near the entrance to the bridge, scattering men and brokenwood across the bank. A second shot followed, then a third, each one hitting closer to the places where soldiers, horses, and wagons were packed tightly together. The Ottoman camp began to crumble. Janissary's music attempted to form a defensive line. They pushed forward with discipline, trying to buy time, trying to steady the retreating masses. But they were too few, and the ground was against them. The camp was built in a half-circle around the river. There was no open space to maneuver, no room to breathe, and the imperial attack only grew stronger. Eugene's infantry advanced with precision, firing volleys at close range before plunging into hand-to-hand combat. Smoke rolled across the field. The sounds of battle became a single, violent rhythm. Muskets cracking, blades clashing, men shouting in languages from across Europe. At the center of the Ottoman position, music, Grand Vizier Elmas Meme Pasha tried desperately to restore order. Music, he rode through the chaos, rallying units, calling officers by name, urging the Janissaries to hold their ground. But the situation was collapsing faster than anyone could control. A surge of panicked soldiers rushed music toward the bridge. The narrow structure groaned under the weight of hundreds trying to cross at once. Wagons were shoved forward without drivers. Horses reared and crashed into each music. Other men pushed, shouted, and climbed over anyone in their way, desperate to reach the far bank where the Sultan stood. Eugene saw the pressure building and signaled his artillery to concentrate their fire. The next volley struck the crowded approach to the bridge. The impact shattered the final sense music of control. The mass of soldiers twisted inward, crushing those at the front. Some were thrown into the water. Others jumped willingly, choosing the river over the blades behind them. And then the bridge began to fail. It started with a sag at music, the center, a deep bend under impossible weight. The ropes snapped. The wooden beams cracked. A section, music, collapsed in an instant, sending men, horses, and carts plunging into the Tisa. The river swallowed entire groups at a time, dragging them beneath the surface before they could scream for help. On the far bank, Sultan Mustafa too watched the collapse in the stunned music disbelief. He could see the smoke rising from the camp, but distance turned the battle into a blur. He saw his soldiers crowding the bridge. He saw the collapse. He saw the water, churn with bodies, but he had no way to reach them, no way to cross back, no way to command the battlefield. Now drowning, music in darkness and panic, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the battlefield grew dim. Fires from exploding wagons lit patches of music, the riverbank. The glow revealed scenes no commander ever wants a witness. Janissaries fighting in small isolated pockets, horses thrashing in the water, abandoned cannons half submerged in mud, a river filled with debris, bodies, and shattered wood, and the imperial army closing in from every direction. Grand Vizier Elmas Meme Pasha refused to retreat. He fought near the center of the camp, surrounded by a handful of loyal guards. When the final imperial push swept through the lines, he fell. With them, one of the highest ranking Ottoman officials to die on a European battlefield in that century. By the time full darkness settled, organized, resistance had collapsed completely. The gunfire faded. The shouting grew weaker. The last survivors swam, crawled, or hid among broken wagons as the current pulled them away. Prince Eugene rode through the music-captured camp in near silence. The battle had lasted only a few hours, but in that short time, an entire imperial army had been torn apart, its bridge music destroyed, its leadership broken, its soldiers scattered across two banks of a river they never finished crossing. Night had fully taken the field, and the Tisa carried the remnants of the Ottoman campaign downstream, music into darkness. When dawn finally broke over Zenta, the battlefield no longer looked like a place where an army had camped the night before. It looked like a place where an army had disappeared. The smoke hung low over the river. The air smelled of burned wood, wet earth, gunpowder, and something heavier that settled into the silence. Imperial soldiers moved carefully through the wreckage. Music, there were no formations, no commanders shouting orders anymore, only scattered groups of survivors hiding among broken wagons, music drifting in the shallows or crawling toward the reeds in hope of escape. Most never made it far. The mud along the riverbank was music, thick and unforgiving, swallowing footprints as quickly as they appeared. On the water, the Tisa carried away pieces of the night, floating music, shields shattered, planks, overturned carts, abandoned, muskets, and bodies turning gently with the current. The river music didn't rush. It moved slowly, almost respectfully, as if aware of what it now held. The numbers would be argued by historians for music centuries, but those who stood on the shore that morning didn't need exact figures. They could see the reality in front of them. Thousands had fallen. Thousands more had drowned. The Ottoman army had not simply been defeated. It had been cut apart in the middle of a river. Near the collapsed bridge, imperial officers discovered music, something no one expected to find on a battlefield. Wagons filled with Ottoman treasure, chests of music, silver meant to pay the army for months, and even the Sultan's personal seal. It was the heart of the campaign, abandoned in music, the panic of the night. Soldiers stared at the treasures as if unsure whether they were real. Prince Eugene music approached without triumph in his voice or expression. He saw what victory looked like. He saw its price. His officers reported the fall of the Grand Vizier, the collapse of the bridge, the drowning of music entire units, and the total disappearance of the Ottoman command structure. Eugene listened. Quietly, he had won the greatest victory of his career, but the battlefield did not feel like a place for celebration. He knew what music this meant for the war. He knew how much it would change. But he also knew music, the truth every veteran learns. Even the cleanest victories leave scars. Far across the river, Sultan Mustafa music, too, was already retreating with the remnants of his personal guard. Those who saw him described a man hollowed by shock, someone who music had watched his army fall apart from across the water with no way to reach them, no way to command, no way to change the outcome. He had come to Hungary to restore the empire's pride. He left Zenta with the knowledge that the pride he music sought had slipped beneath the river. In the days that followed, Eugene did not wait for the Ottomans to recover. He sent fast cavalry toward the remaining Ottoman positions, striking deep into territory, music that had once been secure. The raids were not designed to conquer. They were designed music to send a message. The empire that once pushed into Europe was now on the defensive. Villages that had lived under Ottoman authority for music generations felt the shift. Immediately, some welcomed the Habsburg riders. Others simply watched, exhausted by years of war. But everyone understood the music, same truth. The balance of power had changed overnight. Still, even as Eugene pursued these victories, diplomats across Europe felt the tremors of Zenta more deeply than the soldiers did. For the first time in 14 years of war, both empires were staring at the same conclusion. The Ottomans could not replace what they had lost. The Habsburgs could not afford to stretch themselves further. The war music had reached a point where continuing would cost both sides more than either could bear. The silence around Zenta music was thick, not the silence of peace, but the silence before the next decision. The silence of rulers, generals, music, and diplomats who understood that history had just turned but had not finished moving. And as the last bodies drifted away on the Tisa, another current began flowing beneath the music surface. The current that pulls nations toward negotiation, toward treaties, toward the long shadow of consequences, music that outlast any battlefield. The war was not over yet, but its ending had already begun. In the weeks after Zenta, the echoes of the battle spread music farther and faster than any army ever could. Towns that once feared the Ottoman advance now, music whispered a different story. The empire that had dominated Southeast Europe for music centuries had been shaken in a single evening on the banks of a muddy river. For Sultan Mustafa II, the defeat became a shadow that followed. Music came everywhere. He returned to his capital not as a ruler leading a great campaign, but as a man who had watched his army vanish before his eyes. Power slipped from his hands, and the confidence music of the court slipped with it. For Prince Eugene, Zenta marked the moment the world finally understood who he was. Europe no longer saw a music quiet outsider from France. They saw a commander capable of changing the course of a war with one decision, one march, one music strike delivered at the perfect moment. But the true legacy of Zenta was larger than either man. The battle music broke the momentum of the Ottoman Empire so completely that diplomacy music replaced fighting. Within 2 years, both sides signed the Treaty of Karlowitz, a document that redrew the music map of Central Europe and ended decades of conflict. Lands that had been contested for generations shifted westward. Borders that seemed permanent began to move, and a balance of power emerged that would shape European politics for a century. Zenta did not end music war, but it ended an era. A river crossing meant to carry an army forward. Music had instead carried history in a new direction. Quietly, inevitably, like the slow music waters of the Tisa sliding past a place where an empire once tried to cross.